Reporters for Vice News travel the world, putting a human face to the world's most important stories.
There's a solid wall of riot police officers.
But now, we introduce you to them.
They're doing CPR on one of the casualties here. We don't know if he's going to make it.
This is Field Notes, a show that sits down with our reporters to find out the stories behind their stories and how they got so close to the action.
Feeling pretty good about that?
In this episode, we meet the team who climbed aboard the rickety boats of the Bay Area's Anchor Outs, a community that's fighting to make sure they don't get wiped off the map.
Go!
So this is your boat?
This is my boat, the Kindred Spirits. I grew up on the water.
What do you love about it?
I want freedom, you know? No neighbors, I can be loud. And it's cheaper than living on land.
Howdy.
Hi there.
So I came here at the beginning of the 21st century, and it's a way to get away from the pressures of onshore life.
Why don't you want to live on shore?
Well, paying the rent to the landlord is not my bag at the moment. I mean, the average rent here, I couldn't.
Dan, Mustafa, thanks for joining me today. We just heard from a bunch of Anchor Outs about what their community means to them. Talk to me about what they represent, like on a broader picture.
So the Ankero Community is a collection of a few dozen people who live on boats in Richardson Bay, which is in Marin County, just north of San Francisco. And it's kind of this last group of a dying counterculture in the Bay Area. People who see a way to live without paying any rent, without paying a mortgage, in one of the most beautiful, one of the most expensive places to live in America.
Right, so they're kind of like, they've found a workaround to the obvious and well-covered crisis of housing and inequality in California, in the Bay Area. And Mustafa, it is really beautiful. I've spent a little bit of time on the Sausalito, harbor, and it's gorgeous, and you're surrounded by millionaires, and these are people who are very much countercultural. So, what was it like finding this story, seeing the microcosm here, and then having people talk to you?
The minute you step foot in Richardson Bay, you can tell that it's a place where you have the famous and the rich living there in their waterfront houses, and in the middle of the bay, you have all these kind of sailboats lined up, really just kind of not moving. They're anchored out over there. They have these gorgeous views. And when you start meeting everyone, you kind of realize that, hey, actually, this has been going on for a very long time, because those houses, those boats are stacked. You have one, we met some people who had been living there for 20, 30 years.
Wow.
So yeah, it's the kind of, when you kind of think about deep inequality in America, it's like the most visual metaphor when you go there, because you see these boats, they're stacked, they're semi-derelict, and then across you have beautiful mansions, and then in the marina you have these yachts over there.
Right.
And they've managed to stay there for decades now, except now, authorities are clamping down.
Well, so let's talk about those authorities clamping down, because in a way, if you think about the Anchor Outs, it's like a time capsule to a different era of what the San Francisco Bay Area looked like. They maybe didn't change all that much. Maybe they did. We can talk about that. But certainly the owners of the land around it, around the bay. What was it like for you to be out there? Because, I've seen you cover things on the water before, specifically, and I got, but what was it like to kind of feel that cultural difference and be able to see it?
Going around, we had a local guide basically show us around, a member of the community. I could see the romantic notion of living on the water. You look out and you can see all of San Francisco, you can see the whole skyline, and it's beautiful. It's also a really hard way to live. When storms come around, people really have to lock down their boats. Some people don't know how to handle storms too, so their boats become unmoored from their anchors and crash into the docks, as we see. So it's both a very beautiful and romantic way to live, but it has a lot of challenges.
And those challenges are weather, but they're also what's happening in these people's lives as well. We can romanticize the concept of living on a boat, but some of the lives of the people you're talking about were pretty rough.
Yeah, in addition to the enforcement, which we'll talk about, a lot of these people do work. They work full-time jobs. We talked to somebody who's an Uber driver Our main character, Alex, is a fisherman. So it's not like they're doing this because they don't want to work to earn a living. It's that the living that they're earning couldn't allow them to actually rent a place in this area.
Right, so in order to be an Uber driver in the Bay Area, on that income, they'd have to live hours outside of the Bay Area itself.
Yeah, Marin County, the area where we filmed, famously has a lack of affordable housing and has opposed denser developments. A lot of residents have opposed more density and more affordable housing for decades now.
Right, and so this is sort of a manifestation of that. Is there anything particular, Mustafa, that you found there? Because, like, yes, this is a nationwide story about housing inequality, about the price of housing going up, about people's working jobs not necessarily paying a living wage such they can live where they want to. What were some of the unique aspects that you found? Because it is such a unique place.
I think the first thing that is kind of in your face when you get there is that actually it's not so much about this counterculture. It's not so much about the kind of romantic living and this kind of, idea that people have that, oh, it'd be so great to live on a boat. You go there and it's like, okay, you can tell that this has now become a big issue around class divisions and the deep kind of inequality around that. So I think that in itself, because you get on the skiff from the public dock, which is kind of lined with these yachts that are, the fanciest yachts you'll ever see. And then you kind of make your way through them and you're like, oh, this is such a beautiful day where, I kind of envy people who live on boats, and then you get to the boats and you're like, whoa, 1 second, what's going on over here? I think people who struggle, who can't make rent, who have opted to live alternatively, for them, the good days are the best days because you have the sun out, you have great views around. A lot of the stuff that we heard was, you can be as loud as you want to over there, right? Like, we don't have any neighbors bothering us. So you have those elements, but then you see the conditions of these boats and the way that they're living and actually how difficult it is.
Now, I want to talk about the opposition, like those people who are landowners who believe this is a nuisance of some sort or illegal. But within the Anchor Out community we'll get to that, but within the Anchor Out community itself, is there like broad consensus on like what to do?
So part of the problem now is that it became almost a too popular of a way to live, and a lot of people in the last decade have sort of joined the community. Back in the 80s and 90s, there were far fewer boats, and they were always kind of in violation of this law that says you can only anchor for 72 hours. But then more and more people started joining, and more less experienced people started joining too, and people who don't necessarily know what to do with their boats in a storm or don't have the proper sewage disposal. So there are some in the community who feel both angry at the newcomers and feel like they're ruining it for everyone. And then others, like Alex, who's our main character, really feels a responsibility to make sure that those people don't mess up and cause problems for everyone else and don't cause a further crackdown. But it's almost too late already, as we're seeing. Like, the crackdown is happening, the enforcement is happening, and people's boats are being removed.
And people don't necessarily have any legal protections if they are anchor outs, if they have been anchored out for longer than 72 hours. Is that right?
Yeah, they don't have any legal protections in the way that you would have if you had a house on land. However, if a vessel has people who are living on them, weird maritime laws come into effect that you can't actually board the vessel if the owners are on board, unless you have an order from a judge. So, for instance, the harbor master in our story, he actually doesn't have the authority to physically kick people out, but he has the authority to put an eviction notice, or what would be an eviction notice in the maritime world, that you have X amount of days and what you have violated and by when you need to be getting out. But a lot of the anchor outs, they've had these notices put on their boats for years, and they're still living there because they don't have another option.
Well, that's kind of what I was saying about, like, it's the confrontation of maritime laws or the law of the ocean, or like what's tolerated out in a wild, less than linear world, versus people who've really done very well in the linear world itself and are now like, whoa, I don't know if we can tolerate this anymore. Like, that's the culture clash that is so apparent and so intriguing, because it's deep. It cuts to like a deep part of like the spirit of like American culture in many ways, and also like what it means to survive. Like these are people who in many ways have found a way to survive. Some of them have some personal issues that are pretty difficult to deal with. Certainly there aren't mental health facilities like that are particularly open to a lot of people. So like, I guess that's what I liked about the story so much. It made me ask so many questions about like, wait, what should be tolerated? What should happen when someone maybe breaks the law as it's written? How do communities respond when they're put under pressure? And what's the role of being, someone who made it?
I think what's interesting is that a lot of these people, even though some of them have jobs, are just like one step away from homelessness.
I got hot water heater, I got a shower. Yeah, there's a stove top right here. If you're not dressed in a polo shirt around here and khakis, you don't fit in.
Do you feel judged by the people in this area?
A lot.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They just look at us with disgust. I'm a working man, dude. I work on everything. Motors, cars, trucks, my boat. You get dirty. I've had people come up to me at 7-Eleven and hand me money. And I'm like, I don't, thank you, but I don't need the money,
Work.
I work, I got a job, I take care of myself.
It's like if they weren't on these boats, they'd be homeless in the community. And it's a question of which would the community prefer? If there isn't affordable housing or transitional housing for these people, would they rather they be homeless? And we see in the piece the consequences of pushing people out. There's a homeless encampment in Sausalito right by the shipyard where they crush the boats. And those are people who have been pushed out of the anchor out community.
And you say pushed, they're not allowed to be evicted necessarily by force, so how is it that they get pushed?
So the harbor master goes around and labels boats as marine debris and says they're not seaworthy. And he has a whole criteria for that. He's an experienced mariner, so he has maybe stricter criteria than people in the community would have for what is a seaworthy boat. So he can declare this boat is not seaworthy and it's actually debris and it's clogging up the bay, and puts that notice on. And if people don't respond to it within a certain amount of days, he will hire a company to tow it in. And then if he still doesn't hear from them, they'll crush the boat.
And that was like something I thought really extraordinary about the piece and about the facts on the ground, which is, as you said, they're housing temporarily some of these people who were anchor outs right next to where they're crushing those boats. Like the visual metaphor there is just like shocking, honestly, and heartbreaking a little bit, because you see how much these boats mean to these people. It's their houses, it's their way of life. It's both metaphorical, but also very concrete and real. What was it like? How did you learn that was the case? And when you did, how did it strike you?
Yeah, I think the first day before we even filmed, I went and scouted that entire area. And it was just so shocking to see that the shipyard was actually only, right in front of the camp. I think coming to a certain point of just talking a little bit about why we got to film in the shipyard, I think it goes to show that this story is so tense and so with such, and kind of brings out so much in everybody that everybody actually wanted to talk to us about it. And I think that's why we had such access in the shipyard and with the harbor master himself.
You look at that boat right there, you can see the underbelly of the boat and the mast is tilted to one side. That boat's sitting in the mud.
So it's not floating.
It's not floating. You take a look at every single piece of debris that's on that deck could go right in the water. Gas cans full of gasoline, oil and other petroleum residues off of his engine. People have died out here. It's for the combination of both public safety and protection of the environment.
Do you ever feel conflicted with your role in piece by piece sort of taking apart this community?
I wouldn't say conflicted. Probably a better word is empathetic. I recognize that for many of these people, those boats out there are all they have. That is every single worldly possession that they have is out there on the water. And so in that sense, yes, I feel conflicted. But the bottom line is you're breaking the law.
I think the harbor master's job, on one hand, is enforcing the law, but also, he himself told us, actually, I can't even afford to live over here. And I think that's really emblematic of like what's going on in America right now with deep inequality. Like this is the purest example of what class division is. We know there's rich people and poor people, but this is what that looks like.
Which is to say the people who have the privilege in this situation are looking out for their own interests while putting the people who don't have the privilege to look out for their own interests, but they have nothing to fall back on, no recourse to it. Rather than saying, hey, we're kind of in this together because I live here and you live there, how can we find a way forward? And I think that's the question that the piece kind of asks, is like, what's the way forward here? Is it just that every harbor gets cleaned up? Like it's only rich people get to live by the water? Like, these are tough questions. And I think that's what I ultimately like really respect about the way you guys covered this, is that, and why I imagine so many people would want to talk to you, is because there aren't any easy answers. There isn't like a clean cut, like, oh, this person's right, this person's wrong. It falls in the gray. And it just provokes so many questions about like, how does a community respond to something that everyone kind of knows, like this isn't ideal, right? We can tolerate it so long as there isn't big problems that end up happening. But what you caught and what you saw was the action, the process of it being dealt with in a way that maybe was cruel to the most vulnerable people, in the equation.
And when the solutions that the town or the local agencies come up with creates another problem entirely, which is the homeless camp.
Tell me about that, yeah.
It's a lot of people in limbo. I mean, some people have talked about getting another boat and just going back out again, but it's created a big problem for the city. When we were there were issues with contaminated soil because their homeless encampment is in the middle of like these bathrooms that are used for the nearby tennis courts, and the soil had fecal matter in it, and people were getting sick, all kinds of infections. Some people went to the hospital from it. So kicking the anchor outs off of the bay has created like a whole host of other problems for the town.
I think another thing to keep in mind with the camp is that you have a lot of former anchor outs, as you saw with Tim, whose boat gets crushed, who now live in the camp.
I bought my boat for $27,000 10 years ago. I wanted to live on the water. That was my dream. The water life was always kind.
This is your boat?
Yeah. This is my boat. I don't even know where to start. I mean, as you can see, my whole life was in here.
So what's this?
This is my grandma's photo album that my uncle had that got passed down because he just recently died.
But then you also have other families and individuals who've been living in the camp also for some time, who weren't necessarily living on the water, but that is where that kind of entire community now comes together. And they're fighting for housing and they want the resources around them, but it's not panning out. And as Alex said, if he gets kicked off the boat, that's where he will end up. These are all working class folks. They're trying to, get jobs so that they can at least afford to have sustenance on their daily needs, if not shelter. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of all coming together in that camp. And yeah, that is where once all the boats get cleared out in the next 3 years, is it 3 years?
2025, yeah.
Yeah, so when all the boats get cleared out by 2025, that's where everybody's gonna go. And this problem will just keep growing.
Well, thank you guys for covering this story. It has so much of what's going on in the United States today localized into like microcosm. And I learned so much. And I think it poses a lot of questions that aren't easily answerable. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks.